And now that I have infected you with that earworm, hello everybody, this is your Right Geek and Honorary Man King, here with the first video and what I am planning to have as a series. The series title will be TV That Shaped the Right Geek. This was requested by one of my commentators, where I will be talking about shows that I watched in my childhood and in my early adolescence, that I still remember with great fondness. And what I just played for you at the beginning of this video was the opening of the St. Elsewhere theme. Now, St. Elsewhere was a hospital drama that aired on NBC from 1982 to 1988. I was born in 1979, so obviously I was too young to watch the show when it originally aired. But early on in high school, my local public television station started playing this show in the early afternoon after school, so I was able to catch up on the show that I missed out in my early childhood. I'm currently rewatching it now on Hulu, so if what I say today in this episode interests you, you can go on Hulu right now and watch all 6 seasons of St. Elsewhere. So again, St. Elsewhere aired on NBC from 1982 to 1988. It is a large ensemble hospital drama. It was critically acclaimed and award-winning. It won a bunch of Emmys, it won the Peabody, it won some Writers Guild Awards, and so on, but it kind of struggled in the writings department. It didn't really gather a very large popular audience, although it did gather an audience of dedicated fans, including myself. If you look at the cast lists for St. Elsewhere, both credited cast and also guest cast on the various episodes, you'll see many familiar faces, including a young Denzel Washington in his breakout role. Basically anyone who was acting in the 1980s at one point appeared on the show. That's my theory, and so far it's borne out pretty well in my rewatch. So what is St. Elsewhere? Where is this show set, first of all? So this hospital drama is set in a hospital called St. Eligius in Boston's South End. And St. Eligius is an impoverished teaching hospital that the locals have dubbed derisively as St. Elsewhere because it kind of has a bad rep. That is sort of backed up by the fact that throughout the series, until the final year, the physical plant of the hospital was basically falling apart. Roofs were caving in, boilers were exploding, you often saw elevators stop between floors, or stop entirely, or they would often lose power and have to deal with that situation. So this was a building that was not in very good shape. It was old, it was crumbling, and it wasn't really all that well maintained. They struggled to maintain it. However, the rep was also kind of undeserved because much of the staff, as they're portrayed on the show, are actually quite competent, despite their lack of resources. So, even though the locals kind of looked at it as sort of the second-rate hospital, there were many good doctors in this hospital that really didn't deserve to be tarred with that reputation. So, who were some of the main characters on this show? Well, there was a huge, fluctuating ensemble cast covering every level of the hospital hierarchy, including orderlies, nurses, residents, and attending physicians. I am going to cover those who stand out to me personally from my favorite cast, which was the cast from about season 3 to season 5. Sorry if anyone listening has actually watched St. Elsewhere and you have a favorite that I don't mention here, I'm sorry, but there are just so many characters that I can't possibly cover them all. I'm going to cover the ones that stood out to me personally. First of all, we have the 3 big cheeses. First of all, we have Donald Westfall, who is the director of medicine, the head honcho at the hospital. He is a kidney specialist by trade. And he actually grew up in the neighborhood where St. Eligius is set. So he has a very fierce connection to both St. Eligius and the neighborhood around it. He actually was a kid when St. Eligius was first built, so he remembers the first bricks being laid to this hospital, so he's very, very connected to it personally. Westfall's wife died years ago in a car accident, leaving him alone with his 2 kids. At the time the show starts, he has a daughter who is college age. Her name is Lizzie. And then he has a son, Tommy, who is classically autistic. That's going to come up later in some of the later discussion of this show. Westfall is very committed to community service and outreach to the poor, at times to the point of self-righteousness. He's very, very progressive in kind of a classical sense. The other big honcho here is Daniel Auslander, who is Director of Services. Auslander is like the grandfather of St. Eligius. He's very kindly, but he's not exactly a pushover. He will stand up for himself if he feels he needs to. And the outstanding thing about him is he's a liver specialist who is dying of liver cancer for maximum irony. There is a third big cheese, but I'm going to hold off for a second on discussing him because I could do an entire video on that particular character, so I'm going to come back to him. But let's talk about some of the supporting casts I remember. We have, for example, Victor Ehrlich, played by Ed Begley Jr. He is a surgical resident who is basically well-meaning, but he has no filter whatsoever, so he frequently insults people without really meaning to. He's kind of socially awkward in that way. Then you have Wayne Fiscus, who is the ball cap-wearing ER hotshot, who also has some filter problems. And he's kind of jaded because being in the ER, he sees kind of the worst that society has to offer, and that kind of colors his perspective. Then you have Jack Morrison, aka Boomer. This is a favorite in my family. He is basically St. Elsewhere's designated punching bag. If something bad happens to a character, a large percentage of the time it's going to happen to Boomer. He got educated at a diploma mill in Mexico, and when that was discovered, he basically had to take all of his medical school classes again at the same time that he was serving his residency. So he had work upon work. In an early season, his wife dies in a freak accident, so he gets left alone with his infant son. In one of the middle seasons, he gets raped in a prison riot. Later on, his kid gets a hold of his gun and ends up murdering his rapist. I mean, things don't really go well for this guy. So that's what I mean when I say he's kind of the designated punching bag. But he's, a nice, well-meaning character who has a lot of heart, which is why he's well-liked among my family. We also have Elliot Axelrod. Hey, the guy who played Veer on Babylon 5? Which, by the way, that's another video I should do. But the guy who played Veer, before he was Veer, was Elliot Axelrod on St. Elsewhere. He's kind of the secondary punching bag. It seems like he gets all of the crazy patients to the point that one of the things he frequently says is, "Why me? Why is it always me? Why do I get all the Looney Tunes?" And this character was actually my favorite in high school because I was watching Babylon 5 at the same time, so I liked the actor and kind of followed. The reason why I started watching St. Elsewhere actually was because of Stephen Furst, the actor, and then I started liking some of the other characters in the show as well. Then we have Phil Chandler, which is Denzel Washington's character, who's kind of a square, actually. He's like the original Gordon Goodbrother, as your boy Zach calls black characters that are kind of sedate, so to speak. We have Helen Rosenthal, who is the head nurse and serial monogamist. She gets married like 4 or 5 times throughout her life. And has kids with each subsequent husband. So she's got this whole gaggle of kids that refer to each other by their individual last names, and it's kind of bizarre. And she because her home life is kind of a mess, she later on she gets addicted to pills, so there's a whole storyline with that. And then there's Luther Hawkins, who is an African-American orderly, who, he starts off as an orderly, but he actually, throughout the series, he bootstraps his way up to being a physician's assistant. So that's kind of an interesting storyline that we have going on through the arc of the show as well. Like I said, I can't cover everyone in the supporting cast because the supporting cast is enormous, and from year to year it changes. But those were some of the ones that that stand out for me. So now I can go back to that third big cheese that I implied also existed. So we have, last in the credits, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Mark Craig, who is the chief of surgery. This character was the only character to appear in every single episode, and there was a reason for that. He is the one who is the most thoughtfully conceived of all the characters. Like I mentioned a few videos ago, Craig is a Boston Brahmin with exactly the sort of prejudices and bigotries that you would expect. He is also a proponent of tough love to the point of being a bullying ass at times. He headbutts his surgical residents in the OR and calls them names, among other things. And he kind of has a hair-trigger temper. He's not patient and doesn't tolerate any veering away from perfection, essentially. But the interesting thing about this character, and I kind of implied it in that previous video where I mentioned him the first time, is he, has a soul still. The narrative implies that he had a very poor relationship with his own father, that basically his father forced him to be a carbon copy instead of letting him be his own person. His father eventually commits suicide in his 50s, so that's a whole load of daddy issues right there. The narrative also implies that Craig is actually deeply insecure and is aware of how he comes off to others, but he's a tragic figure in the classical sense, in that he has all of these flaws that he is aware of. He's aware of the reasons why people dislike him, but he is unable to summon the ability to change how he behaves. He's so closed and stuck in his ways that eventually, as the series goes on, he starts losing everyone around him. So his son dies in, I think, season 3. His wife leaves him in season 6. And that's all because he just can't open up and be like a human being around people. He's just so closed and angry and impatient. Like I said, I could devote an hour-long video just to this character because he's so fascinating. But, Greg House, from the show House, this is basically his predecessor. So David Shore is not quite as innovative as he thinks he is. St. Elsewhere got there first in creating a character who has so many dislikable flaws, but is also very interesting and has layers. We also have a whole bunch of recurring characters. St. Elsewhere featured a lot of patients who appeared for multiple episodes, many of them extremely memorable. And the one that is the most infamous, I think, is Mrs. Huffnagel, who was a recurring patient in the 3rd season. She was an old lady who seemed to know everyone's personal problems, which she would bring up constantly when she was interacting with the doctors. So what would happen is all of the residents that had to deal with her, they started hating her because she always seemed to know how to get at the thing that they were most vulnerable about. So they felt extremely put upon by her, and they always tried to avoid her. They kept trading her off. Oh no, I don't want this patient, you take her. The only resident really who had any positive interaction with her at all was Elliot Axelrod, actually. And Huffnagel eventually dies of a heart attack after being crushed by her bed. Which brings me to the reasons why St. Elsewhere is weird. In the last video, I kind of compared St. Elsewhere to Twin Peaks, which might have been overselling how weird it is. However, it is weird in many ways. It is deeply weird for its period. For example, St. Elsewhere, the way it portrays people of the medical profession, they don't turn out looking like paragons. I actually wrote a paper when I was in college for a class on the history of American medicine. And the paper was on how doctors were portrayed in popular culture and how that changed over time. And St. Elsewhere was really the earliest instances of portraying doctors who were human and flawed and sometimes not very good people, even if they were skilled as physicians. So we have, in the show, at one point, one of the residents becomes a rapist and gets shot by a mentally disturbed nurse. Others just become very cynical and ground down because of how difficult the working environment is. And there's a lot of casual cruelty. So see also Mrs. Huffnagel, the fact that the fact that the residents were so put off by her that they basically mistreated her for an entire year because of how off-putting her personality was. And the show doesn't flinch in showing that. It shows that, doctors being human will sometimes allow their personal feelings for their patients to mess up how they actually treat those patients. The other things that make the show weird, there's always chaos in the ER. There's always something off the wall going on there. Sometimes they'll cut to the ER and there'll be like this entire brass band there playing, or like people from a Thanksgiving Day parade will be coming in with a giant Snoopy balloon and stuff like that. So they always had that kind of weird stuff going on. In one episode, a flasher was going through the wards and flashing patients. In another episode, there was a guy that set up a boombox and started singing a lounge act in the elevator. So there was all of these kinds of weird, quirky things that were going on. You had Auslander in later seasons dreaming that he's Superman. And then, of course, there is the elephant in the room. The Wisco Tango Foxtrot finale. Sorry, I'm about to spoil a 30-year-old show, but at the end of the show, we are told that this entire show that we just watched was really the daydreams of Westfall's autistic son, and that none of it actually happened. So, yeah, that's weird in and of itself. So, this show was weird, it was quirky, and that's kind of why I made a comparison to another show that was weird and quirky. But thus, you have now been introduced to one show that shaped my, in this case, early adolescence. I don't recommend you watch it if you can't tolerate something that isn't current year correct. But if you could understand that the show was written in the 1980s and is a historical piece and therefore features what was basically progressive in the 1980s but not progressive in 2020, if you can tolerate that, if you understand history and nuance, go ahead and check it out on Hulu. All 6 seasons are on Hulu now. And if you do start watching it, please comment below and tell me what you think. I'd be interested to hear what some of you youngins might think about this show that I remember very fondly from my adolescence. Thank you for listening, and I will speak to you later.